This is the Hot Stove with Dusty Baker.
Hello everyone and welcome to the Hot Stove. Normally you're used to me talking about Major League Baseball and what's going on around the hot stove in baseball, but this is a very different situation. This is the first ever Hot Stove College Football Playoff Edition, and here is why. The college football rankings that just came out this past Tuesday, well, they are the worst rankings that I think I've ever seen in my life. I could not be more upset and more triggered by these rankings that I had to decide to come onto the show and do a special on that. For the past couple weeks, I've been doing my own personal rankings revolving around college football, specifically because there's an obvious SEC bias. Because of that SEC bias, I've tried to take my own bias out of it because I grew up in the West Coast, therefore I had a minor Pac-12 bias, and then of course going to TCU, I therefore gained a little bit of a bias towards the Big 12. Well, with my system, I assess wins and losses, I assess wins on the road, I assess crucial losses, especially at home or against unranked teams or teams with a less than stellar record, ideally under 500. Not pointing out any specific team in particular just yet, but we'll get to that in a moment. And then on top of that, conference championships are a big factor because why play the game if, of course, it doesn't matter? Anyways, we are currently in the second week of the college football playoff rankings, and so with my personal rankings, I'll quickly go through that and then tell you where they went wrong. Number one, they were right. LSU, I had them as well. Number two, Ohio State. Number three, Clemson. We agreed on all of those because naturally all three of those teams are undefeated and they also have accomplished everything they've needed to thus far. Number four, though, I have not only a massive problem, I am going ballistic. I could not be any more angry with this particular ranking. I love the University of Georgia as a school, and I love their football program and what they stand for, and I think Kirby Smart is an incredible coach as well. But you cannot tell me right now that that is the number 4 team in the country. After losing at home to South Carolina just a couple weeks ago, and then this past week, yes, they put it on against Missouri, but a team that didn't even have their starting quarterback in. You're going to tell me that's what's going to propel them into the 4th seed? That is unbelievable. On the flip side, what I had Minnesota. Yes, do I think that they are probably not a team that will end up number 4? I agree with that, but as of right now, they have the second best game and win over any other team in the country outside of LSU's win this past week against Alabama. And if you're going to look at resume and you're going to tell me that wins and losses do matter, then Minnesota should be 4th on this list because they have the second most impressive win in the country. The third most impressive, in my opinion, is Auburn against Oregon. That was the first week of the season at AT&T Stadium at a neutral site. Anyways, rolling down the list, we'll get back to Georgia in a second. Number 5, they had Alabama. I think Baylor is getting critically disrespected here. Do I think they, once again, are a number 5 team in the country at the end of this? Probably not. I assume they're probably going to lose this week to Oklahoma. Regardless of whether they win or lose, they are undefeated. They just got a victory on the road against a rival in TCU, and it was a grueling matchup that went to triple overtime, but they got out with the W, and that should mean something. In these current rankings that the system has, they just fell a slot. So you're telling me that because Georgia beat a team without having their starting quarterback, that's a better move and a better win for them, while Baylor drops because they had a closer game against a rival on the road. That is absolutely asinine. They are undefeated. They have not lost a game, and therefore they should not be penalized. As for Georgia, they should be heavily penalized. I'll get to my ranking on them in a sec. But so I think they critically screwed up this top 5. Moving down the list really quickly here, number 6, I agreed with Oregon being at 6. 7, they had Utah, I had Alabama. I think that's where Alabama should stand because Bama's loss was not a bad loss, but it was at home, and they should be punished there for the fact that that was a loss at home. They also don't have a great victory either. Their best win is against Texas A&M, and that was earlier on in the year. Then you have Penn State for me at 8, and for them, they had Minnesota. I think Minnesota should be way higher, as we talked about. Number 9, they had Penn State. I, on the other hand, had Utah. At that point, you're just going over a couple numbers. Not too upset about that. Then number 10, we agreed on Oklahoma. Number 11, that's where I had Georgia. I think that at this time still, even with their good wins, That loss, they need to be punished for that. It does not make sense to me how a team like Georgia can get away with losing to a losing record South Carolina team at home, while, of course, you have guys like Minnesota and Baylor that are undefeated that are getting punished because of the schedule that they have. It's ridiculous to me. It's absolutely absurd. Number 11 on my list was Georgia. Number 11 for them was Florida. Number 12 on the list, I had Florida. They had Auburn. Pretty close in comparison, because then we have Wisconsin for me at 13. This is where they had Baylor. I think it's ridiculous. Baylor should not be this low as an undefeated team in the Big 12. So also, one other factor that I have to argue right here, the Big 12 currently has 5 teams in the top 25. Well, if you're going to tell me that the Big 12 is weak, that is also half of their conference. There's only 10 teams in the Big 12. I know that's hard to really understand, and maybe the committee needs to revisit that, but there are 5 teams in the top 25, and if you tell me the Big 12 is weak, well, then I don't understand where that argument is based off of where they currently are ranking those teams. Anyways, going off that list here, now number 14 on my list, I had Auburn. They had Wisconsin. This is when the numbers start to kind of compare a little bit better. Number 15, I had Memphis. I think that win over SMU was very impressive. And, of course, the committee is going to look at them as a lesser team because they're a group of 5. So that's where we differ. I do value the group of 5, and I think that they're way overlooked. There's 3 teams in the American Conference right now in the top 25 as well. So don't tell me that the American Conference is particularly weak at all. They have Michigan in that ranking. Number 16, I have Michigan. They have Notre Dame. 17, I have Notre Dame. They have Cincinnati. I have Cincinnati at 18. They had Memphis at 18. I think Memphis is a better team. We'll find out anyways this week. Number 19, I had Boise State. They have Texas. While I like Texas as a team, there's too many losses on that resume, and they can't go from unranked to 19 immediately. That's a ridiculously high jump for a team that just suffered a loss to TCU a couple weeks ago. On the other side, too, if the TCU loss is that big of a deal, or not that big of a deal, I should say, that allows Texas to be 19, then why is it that Baylor can somehow beat TCU on the road and then they lose a spot? It does not make sense. These rankings do not compare throughout the entirety. I don't think they assess this clear enough because that does not make sense to me. Anyways, 20 on the list, I have SMU. They don't even have SMU ranked. I don't know what happened. I know SMU had a close game this past week against East Carolina. They still won. I'm blown away by some of the logic that the committee has at this time. It's just unbelievable to see what's going on here, because SMU should not all of a sudden fall out of the rankings after getting a victory and after being in the rankings just a week ago as well. They have Iowa in that position. Number 21, I have Navy. At 21, they have Boise State. Not too upset about that. 22, I have Iowa. They have Oklahoma State. They have a reason to have Oklahoma State in there. Oklahoma State has played better of late, and they have had some tough losses as well. Now 23 on the list, that's where I have Texas. I do think they jump into the top 25, but 19, way too high of a jump. Anyways, going to 23 now, we have Navy. That's where they have them currently ranked. Pretty solid ranking for them. 24 and 25, we agreed of K-State and Appalachian State. The point of all of this, though, one thing that I have a real frustration with is it seems like the committee likes to go back on their words. They like to tell you that, oh, a quality win is important, but also if you lose, you should be punished. Well, then why is Georgia, with a terrible loss at home, getting the number 4 seed only a couple weeks later, and the only real win they have that you could look at and say, okay, it makes sense, is Florida? Well, Florida is not even now a top 10 team. So I don't really understand what the committee is thinking right here. Georgia has some great wins. I'm not taking anything away from them. I also personally like Georgia, the university as a whole, and I like their athletic program, but this is a huge issue that we consistently have with the College Football Playoff Committee. They go against what they say. They stick to the brands. They go with the brands. And so I want to assess something real quick before I let y'all go. If the season ends according to these certain scenarios, I think we're going to end up with 2 SEC teams when we should not. So, scenario 1, Georgia ends up going 12-1, wins the SEC. LSU goes 12-1, therefore they're West champs but lose in the SEC championship game. Then you have 11-1 Alabama. You have 12-1 Oregon, Pac-12 champs. You have 12-1 Baylor, therefore Baylor loses in the championship game against Oklahoma. And then 12-2 Oklahoma, they're Big 12 champs. Then you have 13-0 Minnesota. We'll see if they can actually beat Ohio State. I highly doubt it, but for this scenario, keep this in mind. 12-1 Ohio State, and then 13-0 Clemson. With that particular scenario, I think we end up with 2 SEC teams in addition to Minnesota and Clemson. We'll also have Georgia and LSU. That means in that scenario, you'll have a Pac-12 champion, a Big 12 champion left out of this whole thing. And then on top of that, group of 5 also not even considered, because naturally, why should we consider the group of 5 in anything? In scenario 2, it's just a little bit different. Instead, I have it so Baylor wins out. This is the one that really, really frustrates me at this time. If Baylor goes 13-0, they win in the Big 12 championship, and they beat Oklahoma, I don't think they will make it to the playoff, and here is why. They will devalue Texas. Even though they have Texas right now at 19, they still dropped Baylor, who has a victory over Texas. On top of that, against obviously Oklahoma, they'll have to beat them twice. The way the committee works, they'll drop Oklahoma significantly in the rankings, and then say, let's say Oklahoma drops to 23. Well, Baylor therefore beat the number 23 team in the country twice, instead of what Oklahoma really was ranked when they played Baylor. It's very, very backwards. I hate the way that they assess it. It is extremely frustrating to see how they assess each and every team. Most of the time when it comes to the SEC, it's the name brand and also how they looked at it when the matchup showed up. As for the other 4 conferences, we're talking ACC, Big 12, and then also the Big 10, and then the Pac-12. They get scrutinized in a very different way outside of the obvious brands of Ohio State. Usually USC, when they're good, probably would find a way to get around this. I mean, when you're getting the big name brands, Texas as well, they are the ones that aren't getting punished. But when you talk about the Minnesotas, when you talk about the Baylors, it's more along the lines of, well, I hope that you guys enjoy the ranking that you're at right now. And that's what I had heard on Tuesday night, was the committee and specifically also ESPN broadcasters talking about how Minnesota should be happy that they're number 8. They should be incredibly disappointed. They have the second best win against Penn State. Penn State, by the committee, was ranked number 4, and somehow that leads them to believe with an undefeated Minnesota team that they should still be behind several teams with losses, even though Minnesota has the second best win in college football this season. That's my hard take. That's my hot stove for this week. Hopefully the rankings will figure themselves out. We got some big matchups this upcoming week. Minnesota, Georgia will be tested. And let's talk about Baylor too, that game against Oklahoma. We'll see what happens after with the rankings coming up next week. But I don't expect anything less. I think the SEC bias has gotten very over the top. And at this point in time, it needs to be stopped.